Hello and welcome to a bit of a different presentation than usual. This time I'll be talking about the search for immortality from a scientific perspective. And if you're interested in that, then keep on watching. So, the idea of immortality and the desire for immortality has actually been present with humanity ever since we have found out that we are dying. So, if we look at history, there have been many different spiritual, religious, and pseudoscientific remedies for death and for mortality. When we think about, for example, the Flamel's Philosopher's Stone or the Fountain of Eternal Youth, these are some of the more spiritual and alchemic remedies for mortality and things that further the prospect of immortality, and such things have been present with us ever since the dawn of alchemy and even before that, and especially with the rise of pseudoscience. For example, in the Victorian age, snake oil was very present in society, where they sold all around remedies and treatments without any real scientific backing, because the science wasn't as developed back then. But the idea of selling treatments and furthering the longevity of life have been present with us until this day. And for example, when looking specifically at science, not only at spiritual ideas, the ideas have stemmed to the 17th, 18th century, when, for example, Galvin, or here in Erasmus Darwin, who is related to evolutionary scientist Charles Darwin. Erasmus Darwin also furthered the idea that the life energy or the life fuel inside of the human organism is actually electric energy, as they have perceived in machines, for example, with the dawn of electricity and all that. So as you can see here in the small graphic on the right side, they believed that the muscle spasms that occurred with electricity were actually a form of reanimation. And if that idea comes familiar to you, it is probably because of the famous novel from Mary Shelley, Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, where Dr. Frankenstein, he isn't really a doctor, he didn't finish his degree, I won't give him that. Victor Frankenstein reanimated a body, and the novel brings up many philosophical views, but also ideas about scientific prospects, although it focuses on the Faustian myth and the mythos of reanimation, immortality, and hubris. And another perspective, although a more artistic one, is also provided by Oscar Wilde in the novel The Picture of Dorian Gray, where Dorian Gray, young dandy, sells his soul to the devil so that his painting ages and becomes tarnished by his sins instead of him. So this is also the focus on eternal youth, and also talks about the Faustian myth, which is why these are two of my favorite novels. And this Faustian youth is closely focused about the ideas of immortality and eternal youth. And although these are written from an earlier perspective of the 19th century, they bring about many ideas and also sparked an interest in myself whether or not immortality is even a scientific prospect as we stand up now with up-to-date knowledge of science. So this presentation shall focus on the science of biological immortality and the prospect of human immortality. And in order to do that, I'll first of all define biological immortality and its occurrence in the world. Then I'll talk about two theories of aging. For one, the programmed aging concept and the hallmarks of aging. Next up, I'll be talking about the prevention of aging, or the halt and reversal of it, which I'll talk about the mortality of aging, the negligible senescence from the Gray, and the RCM hypothesis by David Sinclair, which are two theories and two remedies of contemporary scientists. And lastly, I'll take a bit of a philosophical route and a bit of an alternative route with the immortal society, what the criticism and alternatives are, as well as the hypothetical consequences. And lastly, I'll have my bibliography as always if you need some of my sources for own research for school or whatever. Feel free to use that, and yes, if this interests you, enjoy. So first of all, biological immortality, its definition and occurrence. Biological immortality is defined as the state in which the rate of mortality from senescence is stable or decreasing, thus decoupling it from chronological aging. And senescence is generally described as aging, as the scientific way of cells aging and diminishing, and the gradual deterioration of functional characteristics of an organism. And there are occurrences of non-senescence or immortality in real world. So some organisms express negligible senescence, so they deteriorate either too slow to be of any importance and are considered immortal due to their extended lifespans, but there is still some senescence there, if you understand what I'm saying. So some plants have immortal genets, so I'm not talking about, for example, the branches of a tree or something, but in this case it would be the roots and the cells of the roots of certain plants that have this negligible senescence. And there are also some immortal bacterial colonies that have been around for a great amount of time that expresses negligible senescence. And there's also the state of cryptobiosis. And cryptobiosis is defined as the metabolic state of life entered by an organism in response to adverse environmental conditions. And this basically says the idea of, for example, freezing a non-dead body that could then, with adequate medical equipment, be brought back to life after its freezing. And the prevention of aging through freezing, for example. There are also immortal cell lines, such as that disobey the Hayflick limit, the natural degradation of cells. And some of these show, for example, cancer cells show telomerase and stem cells, and avoid apoptosis. For example, the HeLa cells, which is a form of cancer cell from a woman back in the day that are still multiplying to this day. Next up, I'll be talking about aging. So there are two main theories of aging. One, we have the programmed aging concept, and then we have the theory of accumulation of damage. And for that, the programmed aging concept is defined by these 6 parts of aging. And if these are to kick in, then aging takes place. This is a theory, basically. So the first one is DNA methylation, which is the addition of methyl groups to the DNA, changing the segment's activity. It's also used for epigenetic clock, and everything that changes the genetic makeup to a small extent, for example, is epigenetics. And there's also cellular senescence, which is the termination of cell replication and mortality according to the Hayflick limit I just mentioned. And the cellular senescence is also caused by stress-inducing factors. Next up, we have the telomeres that protect chromosomes from deterioration and fusion, and attrition after replication stops their function. So imagine every time the telomeres of chromosomes, the chromosomes are multiplying with meiosis and mitosis and all, and with every replication there is an attrition, so a cutting of the extended telomeres. And at some point, at first it is no important material that is cut away, but with the time the aging process kicks in when the telomeres are cut to that extent where it is biologically non-negligible. Next, we have the evolution of aging, where senescence would be beneficial from an evolutionary perspective, and the creation of a selection shadow explaining diseases in older age. So the idea that it is the natural makeup of people to die to make place for the new generations is there, and because of the developed medical research and better conditions, people get more age-related diseases because it is unnatural to live as long if we go about the evolution of aging. We also have the reproductive cell cycle, which is the regulation of aging through reproductive cells, causing senescence in an attempt to maintain reproduction. And we also lastly have autoimmunity, so the increase of autoantibodies attacking the body, causing disease and raising probability of death. So these are all factors of the programmed aging concept. And now we come to the hallmarks of aging, which are part of the accumulation of damage, so that at some point, if there is enough damage caused by these factors, I'll explain in a second, the aging process takes place and gets worse with the years to pass. So we have genomic instability, which is the accumulation of mutations with the epigenetics. We have the attrition of telomeres that I already talked about when the multiplication of chromosomes happens, that the telomeres are cut off and that relevant material gets away. We have the alteration of the epigenome, as you can see here with the DNA methylation I mentioned in the programmed aging process. We have a loss of proteostasis, and proteostasis is the competing and integrated biological pathways within cells that control biogenesis, folding, trafficking, and degradation of proteins, presence within and outside the cell. And if that is lost, different important cell processes cannot take place anymore. Another hallmark of aging is the deregulated nutrient sensing that also damages the body over time and is, I believe it's also affected by the growth hormone, the human growth hormone, which is why there is a lot of research involving that. We also have mitochondrial dysfunction, and although it is not up to date with recent data, the belief that after time, because of the reproduction and multiplication of mitochondria, there is occurring dysfunction, which promotes aging and the degradation of the organism. We also have the accumulation of senescent cells, and meaning degraded cells that after time affect the process of the organism. We also have exhaustion of stem cells, which is also a topic of current research. And we also have altered intercellular communication, and if the intercellular communication isn't active or is not correct, there are no responses to be made that are necessary for normal functioning of an organism, which is why that is an integral part when talking about the hallmarks of aging. And next up, I'll be talking about what is attempted to be done in order to halt and reverse the aging process. And there is this grand discussion among researchers and philosophers, everyone, whether aging is the natural way of life and life as we know of, or if it is humanity's deadliest disease, as it is considered that everyone that does not die of an unnatural cause, let's call it that, dies of aging. And if we go about aging from the perspective of a disease, we may look at data as a proof of the fact that it is the deadliest one. If we look at the fact that there are 150,000 deaths per day, of which 2/3 are age-related, that makes 25,000 people die daily because of age-related causes. And because of this unstoppable fact, people are attempting to research and find out theories and remedies for this immortality. If we look back at what I talked about in the beginning, people are trying to stop mortality. And one of these people is Aubrey de Grey, who is a biogerontologist, and he makes strategies for engineered negligible senescence. So it's not a complete immortality, but it is negligible senescence that is already occurring in certain organisms with that result in extended lifespans. And abbreviated strategies for engineered negligible senescence makes sense, or SENS, which is also the research foundation HX of Aubrey de Grey. And his goal, in his own words, is to rejuvenate the body and stop aging. And the way he wants to do that, by his quote, aging is the lifelong accumulation of damage. So he plays into the accumulation of damage theory I already talked about. Aging is the lifelong accumulation of damage to the body that occurs as intrinsic side effects of the body's normal operation. And the way he wants to go about it is that he has these 7 deadly things and their fixes. And so on the left side you can see the damage type, and on the right side you can see the maintenance approach. So he calls these damage types his hallmarks of aging. And he approaches this, I believe in one of his TED Talks he talked about that we should go about our bodies as we should go about a car. If one thing is broken, you should fix it or change it in order to maintain it and extend its lifespan. And the same thing we should do with our bodies. For example, cell loss, cell atrophy should be replaced and maintained by using stem cells. Division-obsessed cells that could be cancerous, for example, are to be reinforced through telomere control. Death-resistant cells should be removed using suicide genes. Mitochondrial mutation, like mitochondrial dysfunction I talked about earlier, is reinforced by using backup copies of mitochondria. Intracellular waste products are to be removed using foreign enzymes. Extracellular waste products are to be removed using the own immune system. Extracellular matrix stiffening repaired by using cross-link breakers. And every single one of these damage types and maintenance is a presentation of its own. It's very extensive, but what he talks about is that there should be this controlled and constant maintenance. Now there's the question whether or not this is something that is affordable and even possible to manage with the medical and healthcare systems, but it is definitely an approach from Aubrey de Grey. And the second person I'll be talking about is a person that made the hypothesis of the relocalization of chromatin modifiers, or RCM. And this person is David A. Sinclair. He's a biologist of molecular genetics. He went and works at Harvard Medical School, and his goals, in his own words, are the life extension and aging reversal. So he said aging quite simply as a loss of information, and I also believe that he said that in his book I read called Lifespan. And he describes the aging process as also a form of accumulation of damage, or rather a process of accumulation of damage. So we have first the DNA damage, epigenetic damage, which leads to genome instability, which leads to disruption of the epigenome, which then leads to loss of cell identity, then senescence, the degradation, and lastly mortality or death. And he described that as, for example, if a hair cell dies, or the cell identity of a hair cell is disrupted, that is not a big deal to the organism. But if, for example, heart cells begin to act like hair cells, or different or skin cells or whatever, that is a great damage to the own organism. And the way he wants to prevent aging and mortality is by using the NAD molecules. So the epigenetic factors activate wrong DNA segments at the histones through that epigenetic damage. And so-called sirtuins can remove the activating chemicals for the wrong DNA segments. And these sirtuins are controlled by level of NAD, and NAD stands for nicotine amide adenine dinucleotide. But this control dinucleotide declines with age, and thus he wants to focus on delineating and controlling these NAD enzymes so that the epigenetics do not take the damage. And there are these sirtuin activating compounds, STAC, that can be used for boosting NAD, and this NAD then boosting for life and removing aging. And in his book he talks about the effects of NAD boosters, so supplements that boost this dinucleotide, and also the role that for him, for example, in studies have shown that intermittent fasting and high intensity interval training contributes to the NAD production, which then, if you look at the graph on the side, can improve certain functions of the organism, which then leads to an overall improvement of health, which then again leads to an extended lifespan. And the correlation between a healthy lifestyle and an extended lifespan has been present ever since the research has begun. And whether or not you believe or you agree with his scientific approach, there is no denying that a healthy life leads to some extent, in most cases, to an extended life, if there are no other underlying issues or any of that. I'm talking about aging. So, an immortal society, my thoughts and speculations. So, an immortal society has been always linked to, for example, religion and even hubris. It is believed that the natural way of life is aging and then dying if nothing else happens. And there is this criticism from, for example, religious associations and all of that. As, for example, you can even see in media and literature, Frankenstein, for example, the main focus is the criticism of the character's hubris. But on the other hand, there has been made a lot of research into it, not only the theories of senescence I've talked about by De Grey and Sinclair, but there are also things like nanorobotics, if something happens to the organism, that it is improved by a form of nanorobotics that is also in research right now. And if you look at fictional universes, for example, Cyberpunk 2077, I know that the game isn't good, but for example, that is a projection of what life could be and how lifespan and health could be extended using robotics. Then on the other hand, we have cryptobiosis, that is this extended state of life through freezing, for example. I believe Walt Disney was even freezed, so when the dawn of medicine has reached that far, he could be defreezed and live on with his life, but I'm not quite sure if that's true or not. And there are other things like gene therapies and so on that are currently under introspection of how we could extend the natural life and how we could remove aging and mortality. Then there is the question of ethics, whether we should even look into and how far we should extend life, and whether or not an extended life is even a fruitful life, a good life, and what that would mean for society. And I mean, if you start with the hypothesis of immortal life existing, there are countless routes you could take when, talking about society and philosophy and all of that. I mean, what would the social and economic consequences even be? I mean, there would be overpopulation if there isn't a change in the birth rate, for example. And of course, if there is a technology invented for immortality, how would that go well with capitalism? Would there be something like an elite society that is allowed to be immortal, so that we have people believing themselves to be high creatures because they have access to immortal technology, for example? And would we have something like a separation between immortal humans and mortal humans, as we have, for example, in Lord of the Rings. We have basically immortal elves that are separated as a race from other people, and I know there are different factors in that specific example, but it would be interesting to think about what immortality would actually mean for society. Yes, thank you for listening. This was a bit of a long one. I hope you endured my rambling. If you've even made it that far, I thank you. And these are my sources. It's a very interesting topic, and I enjoyed researching for it. And yes, if you've made it that far, have a nice one. Thanks for listening.